the City Council work session of February 20th to order at 6 p.m. Roll call, please.
Mayor Copeland,
Here.
James Burton,
Here.
Kenneth Jones, Jeff Guard,
Here.
Alina Meyer,
Here.
Ann Schaefer,
Here.
David Allison,
Here.
James Weiss is absent.
Okay, thank you. We have a quorum. So the first work session topic is tax options, and the second is Prince William Sound Borough discussion. We'll just kind of see how those unfold. If I'm kind of assuming council may want to spend a little more time on the tax part of the discussion, so if we're kind of halfway through, I'll give the warning shout. But City Council has prepared some options in background here for us, and with that, I'll turn it over to Manager Lanning.
Interesting that we're here at this juncture. We started way back with our strategic planning and 2020 plan to reach the year 2020 budget, and with the goal of being self-sustainable. I think at the time we talked about our ability to do everything we wanted to do on what we could raise locally without as much dependence upon outside sources. Of course, in that year we were down $1 million plus. For example, the school bond debt payments were down $250,000 that year. So, you know, we went through some tax discussions as part of that process, considered some of the options, came up with a couple which were approved by council by ordinance and then rejected by the voters for this year or last year. So then we pursued one of our #1 priorities, which was the harbor maintenance and construction, and we are pursuing the $5 million harbor grant. Of course, we have to have a match. We have to have sufficient resources to be able to do ongoing maintenance with that. We've raised fees by 5%. We've talked about doing that 5% a year for 5 years to get back into a strategic position of being able to meet capital needs. And part of that discussion has also been how we pay for the harbor match, and so we've talked about 5% raw fish tax. We talked about those methods. Holly had previously prepared for us, and you have gotten this sort of an examination of our tax options. Holly and I have talked about ways to use taxes and different things. We've also talked several times about reorganizing the top tiers of our management structure. And we're working through that right now. The intent for us is to reduce our costs at the top somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000. So in association with that, trying to do both things, and we sure have a long ways to go on that part of it, but again, the idea is to culminate in 2020 as we prepare our next budget. We'll have some direction, you'll have some understanding of what we're trying to do. We've got recruiting processes, structural processes, we've got a few things that we have to look at. And then we wanted to present tonight, Holly has a memo in the packet, in the work session packet here, with a examination of the various taxes. I'll turn it over to Holly so she can run through these with you. You can ask us questions. I think our goal is, if you desire to pursue any of these or this direction, to give us feedback so that we don't spend time pursuing things that you're not interested in. And I realize we might have, or going to have, some council changes in March, but at least this will give us a good basis for that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Holly.
Ready? All right.
So you're gonna have to bear with me tonight because this is actually going to require a lot of active thinking. There are a lot of pieces to taxation that will likely influence the direction you give us. And that goes from both implementation, the value of the tax, the revenue that's raised, the incentive components and the de-incentive components, so the markets and the industry that you're taxing and what they mean to your community and how that will impede them or in some instances help them, and then also what the audit and enforcement and resource costs on the back end are. So there are about 5 pieces as I go through each option. I'm going to flag. I'm not going to, I promise, go into extreme detail because I think I'll leave that for you to mull over, but at least you'll have that flavor. And Alan and I have talked about a lot of these in more detail. But again, this is really just to get an idea of where you might want to head. And so we have draft ordinances we've worked on, but there's a lot of options because you're a home rule community, so you have a lot of authority to tax. So one of the first things that you would likely want to consider is simply increasing your sales tax. That is always an easy option because you have a system in place that allows you to implement it, to enforce it, and to estimate what that will generate so you can budget for it. I'm not going to spend too much time on that one because it's very straightforward. One of the more creative options that your city manager has been working on is looking into implementing a use tax. A use tax is in essence a sales tax, but it's taxing the use of the personal property generally rather than the sale of it. So instead of the store or the service provider taxing, collecting the tax and then remitting it to the city, what would happen is the city would come up with a mechanism in order to have the buyer self-report the use. So what that tax does is all of those goods and services, or whichever goods and services you choose to focus on, will then be taxed on their use. So they could be, a good example is someone could go to Anchorage and buy a car. And if you had a use tax on vehicles, they would be expected to then report they would have a form or a tax return in essence, where they would report that purchase and then pay a use tax on that purchase. So use taxes are very simple and they're well within your authority, except when we're talking about enforcing it. If you're doing a across-the-board tax on the use of goods, it's very hard to know what they're using and to find a point at which to tax it. I mean, I think you can kind of imagine just going through a Costco run on Ferry and how would you get somebody to really accurately report that. So a lot of communities outside of Alaska, because we only have one municipality that has imposed a use tax, and they are, in full disclosure, upon contacting them, they were unaware they had a use tax. So I don't think that's a great revenue generator for them because I don't think they're following through on the tax, but it is on their books. They have that option. But what we find is a lot of communities outside are very pointed with this tax. They apply it, they implement it in a way that it doesn't impact the resident, but rather the individual residents, but it's a corporate tax. And so it'll be a use tax that you can either itemize, or you can, if you're a corporation, so it's not a tax that would be imposed upon individual residents, so you can itemize it, or you can choose to do an income-based report. And that is, the city would then figure out how much would be a fair tax, or what would be 1%, say, or 2%, whatever rate you set, based on the income of the corporation, and they can make a choice. So I will either itemize, or I'll just say I'm going to pay you, $2,000 a year, or whatever it is. So that gives the city flexibility to craft a ordinance or proposal that takes into account the needs and the abilities and the vulnerabilities of the corporations here in Cordova, because of course economic development is always important. So that is one of those, I would say, is a benefit to a use tax, is that it's very fluid and flexible and can be crafted to actually fit Cordova. Another way that people create a controlled use tax is they tax just a particular group of goods. So for example, building materials. When you have building materials coming in or raw materials, they usually come on one invoice that's usually done by a somewhat sophisticated entity or buyer that can say, wow, I'm making a big purchase, and so I know that I'm going to have to self-report this to this extent. And because you have a high dollar good or service, you can then tax at a rate that's not a high percentage, that doesn't put a lot of burden on the taxed buyer, in theory. Now, again, there's a political component to this that is outside my purview. What that burden looks like, what the sort of the tolerance of your community is for these taxes, what helps, what hurts, that's going to be the difficult decision that you will have to make. I can help you identify where you would need to put a program in place. So a use tax is a very viable option, I think, for the city to consider. Another type of tax that would be easy to implement is a excise tax on marijuana, alcohol, tobacco. These are taxes that a lot of your neighboring communities turn to. And much like a bed tax, we have a lot of documents, a lot of ordinances that we can just lean on in other arenas, and other home rule municipalities, and that is of great benefit to you. It also allows you to mirror the tax rates of your neighboring communities so that you have that harmony economically, which is often very valuable to councils when they're walking through these. So I'm going to take a breath because I feel like I just went through 4 tax structures very quickly and just check in with you and see where you are.
I was just curious about the excise tax because I thought I saw that things can only be applied, have an excise tax applied to them once. So I always thought of excise tax as like production or extraction tax. So if you had a brewery in Cordova, say, and it had an excise tax, one thing, but you can actually have excise taxes on like alcohol that's brought into the community and then resold.
Yes, so what you have is you have a tax on distribution almost. And we have to, when we are setting up that tax and when you're valuing it, because one of the fun processes that your administration will be faced with is figuring out what's the value of these taxes. Because if you have a tax, let's say you were going to tax marijuana, and so you're taxing it at the distribution level. Well, if that tax is going to bring in $50 every year, and the administration of that tax is going to cost you $50,000, that's probably one you're going to take off the table for a while. Or it might be one that you have that infrastructure set up because an excise tax on tobacco is going to be very valuable. But so basically, it is confusing. And one thing you'll find is there is always vulnerability on whether or not our tax is called an excise tax, but it's truly an income or a sales tax, and vice versa, because it's really who is paying the tax, where are we taxing this? And so you would have to give exemptions in certain cases for sales in certain arenas, because there can be overlap and you do not want to double tax something. You are not constitutionally permitted to do that, so we would avoid that. But so let's say you have tobacco sales and it's getting taxed by the retailer is applying a tax that is imposed on the buyer. So the buyer pays the tax as part of, let's say the cigarettes are $10, and someone walks in and buys a pack of cigarettes and pays the extra $2 an extra dollar sales tax. That's just part of your general sales tax. So then if you have a tobacco excise tax, when that product is brought in wholesale, then there's an excise tax paid by the wholesaler for that act and that process of distributing or bringing in that large, that shipment of tobacco. So there's different points of sale, and there's different activities that their tax is being applied to. The idea being resources from the city go into creating the infrastructure that these products need to reach their ultimate destination. And so it depends on who, the resources used are different depending on who is paying that tax. What you can't have is that individual paying that tax twice. So then you get into the esoteric, are they paying the tax twice because the price increases because and so you have, and that is really how we get to where do exemptions have to be, where is the tax, what are we really taxing, which I won't delve into too much now, but that is something, go with an excise tax on particular products. There will be exemptions from the general sales tax in some arenas, and in others there won't, and I'll detail why and how that takes place. Another interesting thing to just dovetail into into your question, you cannot just tax one thing. Alaska is a very interesting state in that it finds it unconstitutional for you to say just tax alcohol separately. So if you are going to tax alcohol, we have a completely different taxing statutory requirement title that we have to deal with alcohol. You have to tax something else. And I think, so they're avoiding discrimination, but they do it in an odd way because it's not. So they're getting at uniformity, but it's not true uniformity, right? Because you add something to it and you're good to go. And it's odd. I'm not sure that I understand the theory that underlies it, but it is something that we will pay attention to if that's the direction you want to go.
Questions, council?
What about surtaxes? Because I remember when before we were trying to decide how to set up the selling of marijuana in town, in the ordinance there was talk of a surtax. Is that allowed to be specifically applied to one item or no?
No, and we don't, it's a good question because we don't have guidance on that case, but I try to be conservative and always keep my clients on the right side of the constitutional challenges to a tax because you will face them. I mean, I think that you always have, especially if you have on the other side of a tax, a organized, interested, engaged association or group, and you have that whenever you have you have that with CHAR, you have that with other associations, so it's important to be, so, I mean, but it's a really, so I would say no because I would say yes, you have the same coupling requirements because you have the same purpose and intent analysis that led the court to where it got on, where it ended up on excise. Anyone else? And I have a couple more, but I think those are all pretty big. The excise tax and the use tax, those are big. And the surtax, that one's complicated because we like to throw names out there, but names are really, they're tricky because it's not about the name, it's about the actual substance of what you're doing. And so whatever we call it, whether we call it a excise tax or a good example is a fuel tax, that is a fuel sales tax or a fuel excise tax, it doesn't really matter what name we give it. It matters how, here that's not an option for us right now for reasons we're all aware of, but it matters how we implement it and then that you understand it. Because I think this is one of those areas where lawyers, have maybe made things a little more convoluted than they need to be, and then it makes it very hard to educate the public on systems that really work for you, because councils and administration struggle with the minutia. So whatever we do, we just need to make sure we do what you want, that it's very deliberate and it's very clear to you what you're proposing. And I think that's one of the things your city manager was hoping. Taking this approach would give you those tools. All right, I'm moving on if nobody has questions.
Well, on the alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco surtax that's been brought up many times in the past as an idea, could we not add it to the current sales surtax and be in the clear for constitutional requirements? 'Cause it's,
You could do an
Okay.
increase of the,
so I think that's when we were talking about marijuana, we were talking about adding it to this one, so it wouldn't have been just by itself. There's already two items that were taxed at the same level.
which would be fine.
Okay.
And when I say which would be fine, I believe it would be fine. I mean, again, marijuana tax is also a very new area for us. So that's certainly been done and has not been successfully challenged.
So, and we already kind of have a tax structure for bed and vehicle rental stuff. We could just add those things to that, just amend it to add 3 or 4 items if you wanted.
Yes.
And administratively, the structure is all in place. Okay.
And there's some difference, you know, when we look at bed tax, that's one, for example, we have to be, and you have full authority and you have a system, and so that's, we just have to be very careful that we are actually taxing everything the same if we're including them in one, you know, if we, which is easy to do for us at the, you know, it's easy for us to craft something that does that, but it is important that we're detailed when we do it, so that you don't, because whenever we're changing that structure to encompass other things, we run into the potential that we'll create a tax on something, but we're actually taxing it at a different point just because of the reality of whatever it is that we're taxing. So, you know, so a good example too is, you know, we could have a vehicle registration tax, which we have, right? But we could also have a use tax on vehicles, and maybe the point of taxation at that point, if you had a use tax, is collaborating with the DMV to make sure that the use tax is charged at the time of registration. And that might be, or that the form is completed. I'm not sure that they would take, I mean, I highly doubt that they would take on assessing the tax, but to have a form there that people fill out, and then that's a percentage. And then also, I recommend as you go through these that you have a work session, or that you include in your conversations at the council table what the results of the tax are, because sometimes the unintended results of one tax are non-existent for another one, and they're not part of, that is one of the biggest errors I see councils make, is that they just don't think through the entire structure, and then there's a loss. There's a loss, an economic loss that wasn't anticipated. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just kind of processing. So if you have a bed tax in place that's kind of intended use is to have signage and services for visitors or something, and then you start adding other taxes that really is intended for a different use, then you have kind of a mismatch. So.
Exactly.
Okay. Questions, council?
Yeah, I have a question about the surtax. Because ours says it's equal to 100% of the sales tax. Is that normally how surtaxes work, or can we put like a percentage in there saying that it's 6%, or is it always a percentage of an existing tax?
It's usually a percentage of an existing tax, but your language is not my favorite. You know, you have some odd, because it's hard to follow. I strongly believe somebody who is going to be subject to a tax should be able to open it up and read it easier than their 3rd grade child's homework. You know, it should be very easy to understand, because it's coming out of your personal budget. And so the federal tax code has not, it's not a good example of that, no, but it's, especially when we're reliant on self-reporting, and I think that is the other reason why your administration is being so careful on how they do this, because given the city of Cordova's hesitance to accept these revenue-raising efforts in the past, making sure people understand what it means for them might make a difference or not. But at least I think that is sort of I'll leave that to the city manager, but I think that's part of the process here, is to sort of change the way that these are considered, so it's more comprehensive. Which leads me to some of the next taxes I'm going to talk about are a little different. They're taxes that may be outside, you might probably have not seen them. One is a real estate transfer tax. Alaska is one of the few states that on a state level doesn't impose a real estate transfer tax, which is the taxation of that act of transferring property. So if you transfer real property, that's a large ticket item, and a 1-2% tax. I mean, if you imagine you have a $500,000 sale and you apply a tax that requires $400, that usually does not impede economics. It's the theory. The theory behind it is that's not stopping anybody from doing that transfer or entering into that sale, but because it's one hit and it's at times people, and when I say people, I include corporations and entities in that. They can budget for that, they can plan for that, and so can the city, because we have a lot of numbers. We have a lot of numbers that shows what those sale rates are, when they happen, at what level, and it's a buy-in into the community, because usually when you have those transfers, you also have a increase in services and a so it's a very pointed tax, and so it's very odd to me that we don't have it here. I can't find an example of it, but it has been really successful in other jurisdictions. So that is something to pay attention to. That is another tax that sometimes has a exemption that gets residential properties out of the mix and applies it mostly to commercial transactions. But I don't know, that's not always the case. So there's a lot of flexibility there as to how you apply that tax. So that's probably, that's the other taxes that are out there that are not, some of these are not my favorite. One of them is internet sales tax. You hear a lot of discussions right now about Amazon and getting a tax out there on Amazon. Unfortunately, in Alaska, this isn't very viable for us right now, because the places in Alaska that are taxing the Amazon sales, they have an Amazon storage unit within their boundaries, within their municipal boundaries. So there's no question as to their ability or right to assess the tax. Without that, you have grave risk, because we don't have a state tax. If we had a state sales tax, then we would have a lot of opportunity on the municipal local level, because we have recent Supreme Court direction telling us that we have that authority. We don't have it. So I think Alan's watching this as it hits Juneau through the Municipal League lobbying efforts. Is that right? I think they're on it this session, right? Yeah. So they are going to be engaging our legislature to try to get the mechanisms in place that will give you that freedom. But right now, I would not recommend we put a lot of energy until we have that. Another tax is the passenger vessel tax. I know that Cordova gets a portion of that tax, but at the same time, it gets a portion of the tax under the structure that has been set up by the state. That is a tax that you can choose to exempt yourself from the state apportionment and tax outright as a community tax. The problem with that tax is that the Cruise Ship Association recently successfully challenged I think it was Ketchikan's local tax that mirrored the state's in some ways. And when they did that, they challenged the broad application of the tax or of the use of the tax funds. And so now, right now, and I don't know if it'll be appealed, but the court came down and said, look, this tax is not for passengers. This is not for the types of resources that you provide because you have this massive influx of people or because you provide these attenuated services. This literally has to be to service the vessel, not the vessel owner. So that means if you need additional resources to get a ramp that goes out to vessels, or if there are infrastructure components that service the actual vessel, then this is a good idea. And I think you have addressed a lot of your concerns in that way with the bond, but then looking at an additional or supplemental CPV tax is certainly an option, but it's very limited. And so before you go too far down that road, I think the administration would like to provide you an idea of what that would look like, what you'd be paying for. So I think that's a lot. I think I've gone through like quite a bit of information here. There is in the memo, you'll see things regarding aircraft registration taxes, and let's see, what other ones do we have that are a little bit more, the residential boat tax, and these are, I think, realistically, these are taxes we can bring to you for consideration, but they're not going to be the meat that pays for those very essential services that you guys are grappling with funding right now. So unless the administration would like me to go into more detail, I think it might be best to focus on the ones I threw out there. What do you think? I mean,
Do we have any questions?
I have one question about the real estate transfer tax. Would that change would be able to use that as, for our assessment for property tax? Because right now, correct me if I'm wrong, the assessment for property tax, we don't have sales information on there.
It's a non-disclosure.
It's a non-disclosure for the state. So if we had a real estate transfer and we're collecting a tax on what that is, would we use that sales to change the assessment of that property?
probably not, because it would literally be based on the actual dollar amount, which is different than your assessment. Your assessment is set by methodology requirements in a separate section of the code for real property. And real property has its own very clear requirements, both for figuring out what the tax amount should be, what the limitations are on the mill rates that you charge, to foreclosure and collections and audits. So it would be separate.
So council, we have a couple options. I suggest maybe we could go into the borough discussion if there are no more tax discussions. And then in the past, I know we have people in the audience that will have an opportunity to speak on the regular meeting agenda. But also typically if there's time left in the work session, councils appreciate feedback from the audience. So is there any further questions on taxes or? Okay. And do you head back tomorrow, Holly?
I do.
Would you be available in the morning if there's any questions or anything, or?
Absolutely. I'll be in
Okay.
here at around 9:39 and available.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, the second item on the agenda is the Prince William Sound Borough discussion. And there's a draft resolution included in the packet. So I will just open it up for discussion. Councilman Burton.
I see two different draft resolutions. The first one, well, I'm guessing the first one is the official draft resolution. The second one is something else.
The first one was the one that I think staff came up with, and the second one was I sent to Susan.
Yeah. So this was just the first cut. The second one is just the first cut that Councilman Jones brought forward meeting or two ago. And then staff since had a resolution drafted by council, I believe, so.
Okay.
Did we have someone join us online? Okay. I just thought I heard a thing in the background. Discussion, council? Councilman Jones.
Yeah, well, I pushed pretty hard to have this topic brought up at a work session a couple different times. And the reason being is I think that it would be in our best interest to get something on the books, a position one way or the other. Since I first started pushing for this, every other community inside Prince William Sound region has come out with a letter of opposition. Valdez, Whittier, Geneva, Titlic are all opposed to the formation of a borough. And they have resolutions on the books saying so. And yeah, I would like to see us follow suit and just write down the reasons why we don't support it at this time. And you know, future councils can always change their mind and decide to look at it again, but this has been studied a couple different times now. And one thing I didn't really get is how in this staff memo it said that it'd be economically feasible, but my understanding of the study was that it was only economically feasible if we could tax the pipeline, and that isn't realistic. The state's looking at stripping the pipeline tax from all the communities as it is right now. Why would they give it up to a borough?
And Councilman Jones, if you, just for clarification, this is structured, the staff draft resolution is aimed more at the current structure that's been put forward. And so I just wanted to clarify, is that your intention to have, or that you oppose the borough in general, or just oppose the structure that's kind of come forward from this, like Girdwood governance and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I oppose a borough in general. I strongly oppose Girdwood being included. If we were to move forward with a borough, I'd feel more comfortable having it be the communities inside the Prince William Sound region, not a population center that has no ties to our economic anything. I mean, they're an urbanite Anchorage suburb, not a Prince William Sound community.
Okay, other discussion, Councilman Burton?
In the staff memo, it says that staff recommends taking no action this time as nothing is being requested. I might understand that that means that staff would recommend just not taking action, not passing a resolution one way or the other.
I think based upon, the Governance Association has kind of put a halt on the whole thing. They're considering something else. Unless you feel strongly about saying, no, I don't think there's anything required of us at this point. So we're just saying, let's not do anything positive or negative at this point and just stop. Until we reach a point where we're forced to make a decision positively or negatively.
Well, that was my position on this, but I know now that we've used staff time, we're here. I was saying last meeting was I didn't want to spend the money to have to go through draft resolutions and staff time and things like that. But now we're here, so I'm indifferent, but I agree with your assessment.
Councilman Allison?
Yeah, with the exception of resolutions that are required for certain things in our code, I'm not too keen on resolutions. they're pretty meaningless, don't have teeth. I could name you lots of examples, and we just went through one of those in our budget. But as I said at the last meeting, sometimes it makes people feel better. Might make somebody feel better if we pass a resolution one way or the other. I can tell you that there aren't very many people that support a borough with the information that's out there right now. Not everybody is against it, but most. Haven't heard very many comments to the contrary. So regarding this particular item, I guess I'm indifferent as well. I'm happy to pass a resolution that says something, how the council feels today, but again, that could change at any time, and the next 4 months are gonna be pretty interesting statewide as soon as our new budget director figures out that she can pass on costs for the state and the unorganized borough into boroughs. We're gonna be playing defense on this and not offense, and every football team that's ever went into overtime, when you can score and end the game, you win the flip, you're gonna take the ball. And I'd certainly rather play offense than defense. At some point in time, we're gonna need to work together with other communities. But at this time, I don't see, Girdwood's not pushing this. Currently, the state isn't, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that change within the next few months. I could approve any of these resolutions. They really don't mean a whole lot to me.
Councilman Burton? Or Councilman Meyer? And I just want to remind council that Councilman Meyer and also our planner, Mr. Stavrig, actually were able to attend some of the meetings, so if you have questions for them too.
Yeah, I don't really support either one of these resolutions. The first one, I think maybe I'd have an easier time supporting it, but the committee has not listed a formal letter or anything that has a list of questions that they had. I think the conclusion was that it was economically feasible and it could lower the rate of Cordova if we chose to. The Excel calculator was very in-depth, and it also had the option to take out any miles of pipeline, and it was still feasible with 0 miles of pipeline for Prince William Sound Borough. So just because something is economically feasible doesn't mean that we necessarily want to do it, but I'm not comfortable saying one way or another that I support one or don't support one. I think that is just a lot of unknowns, and financially how we are right now, I don't support putting more money into more studies that would be needed to have an opinion about it, really. So I would rather like to see a resolution that just says that we no longer need the Prince William Sound Advisory Committee, and that we're not going to pursue looking into this until the question comes up again. I think it's going to come up again. I looked through some of the studies and reports this morning, just before this meeting, and even in 1960, there was a meeting with the Local Boundary Commission at the Cordova High School, and it says, the residents of Cordova who attended the meeting expressed an immediate need for a Prince William Sound Borough. So it's been talked about a lot, and even in 2003, it said that there was a resolution that the city of Cordova City Council adopted endorsing the formation of a Prince William Sound Borough. So I think at times we've been for one, times we've been against one, but there's just a lot of unknowns, and I don't think that we need to spend our time and resource on it right now. But if it becomes mandatory or things change, then we need to look at it again. But the second one I thought was very kind of pitting us against Girdwood, and I also don't have an opinion whether Girdwood is included or not included. I see some benefits to it. maybe there's some, maybe we can think that they're so different than us, but I guess I don't like to just point out the differences. I'd like to focus on the similarities and what we could do to each other, so, or help each other out. Those are my thoughts on that, and I kind of drafted up a resolution if we wanted to do one that listed out the history about the times that Cordova has visited this question of a borough in the past, and list some resources to go with it, and then just ending with that this City Council of Cordova deems that the Prince William Sound Advisory Committee is no longer needed at this time. But I'd rather keep it simple and not go into too much detail about for or against it.
Okay, so I think so far I've heard from council, there's some opposed, some are indifferent. Are there any in favor of pursuing a borough at this time, just for the record? Okay. Any further discussion, council? Questions?
I don't think anybody's in favor of necessarily forming a borough. I can't help but wonder if this question is gonna be back in front of us in the next few months again. Especially if Valdez comes to the table, if they lose taxing authority over the terminal and some of that, so. I can keep an open mind, even though I don't necessarily support this personally right now, so.
Councilman Gard.
The whole reason we went into this was to collect information so that we, protect ourselves. This did get shoved down our throat. So if leaving the door open, although none of us are in favor of doing the Prince William Sound Borough now, it makes it easier to defend ourselves at a later date. I'd be in favor of first president, more in favor of the first president.
Okay. Further discussion, council? Councilman Burton.
If we're gonna adopt one resolution, I would go with the first one. The second one feels a little too negative.
Okay. That sounds like some guidance for a motion. Councilman Jones.
Yeah, so one comment I heard earlier was that didn't want to spend any staff time. Well, these were both already drafted before the last meeting when I requested this again to be a workshop. These are both drafted back in January. Susan had this to us. So staff time was used a long time ago, not just at the last meeting. Also, I was just curious, this is still a work session, so how could we open this up to community members who might have something to say about this borough topic?
At your request?
Yeah, I'd like to request that.
So, okay, so sounds like a motion to open it up for input.
Yes.
Any opposition? Okay, and I'd just like to, because of the time, just like to kind of keep the rules of public discussion to 3 minutes, and also open it up to either feedback on taxes or borough. And if you could just state your name and residence for the record, appreciate it. Thank you.
Mayor, can I
Yes.
say one thing just
Yes.
before you delve into this?
Uh-huh.
Whatever decision you make, one of the things, if a petition is filed by any entity trying to form a Prince William Sound Borough, there will likely be a review of your minutes, of your resolutions, of everything that you have, going through the criteria and the regulations, trying to show whether there is support for or against whatever your position is. So, for example, if it was filed and you decided to oppose a borough, so you decided to submit a response, which will have time, if that was the case, you'd have time, and so I think it falls in line with what you've been saying. We will be looking, so even just having a draft resolution in there, excuse me, is a useful tool, because everything you say and everything you submit reflects some of the criteria. For example, it actually is a consideration how harmonious your culture and your needs and your resources are with one another. So just something to keep in mind. I just want you to be aware of it as you go down the street.
And Holly, this is just meant to be a very simple answer if you have it, but can the Boundary Commission initiate a boundary of their own authority in form or borough? Okay.
Yeah, and they do very much support organization of boroughs and unorganized borough regions. I'm not saying that means, and there will be plenty of notice and participation but you don't necessarily have, sort of a veto authority over a borough.
Okay. All right, thank you. Yes.
One quick question. So what you're saying is if we left both of these draft resolutions in here without adopting either of them, that would be better ammunition for us if we did not want a borough, as if we chose one over the other?
No, I mean, you're okay, if you decide to adopt the first resolution, the first resolution does, one good thing about that resolution is it recognizes that you have created a committee and you have authorized and mandated that it do certain things as part of its duties. This silences that committee for now. It stays their efforts. And so that's good administratively in that direction. And you can use that committee as a way to quickly respond to a filed petition. So that is good. The other resolution provides some insight into reasons why the particular communities may not be appropriate for this borough. And so if you're going to speak against that or for it, just know it's not without consequence. People will go back and say, well, they said they were harmonious and Girdwood looked, it fit them, or they said it didn't fit them if somebody else is opposing it. So, which is fine, I think, because without a direct action, it's not. But, so I guess in answer to your question, I don't see the first resolution posing a problem because it's more administrative. You're not saying anything is good or bad. I don't see the second resolution as being a problem if you're going to oppose it. If you think there's a possibility you'll support it, then that may hurt you because other people might file an opposition and rely upon your own comments. So that's just something to keep in mind. So when you're having this conversation, you're having it fully informed.
Okay, thank you.
Dave Gleason, 609 Cedar Street. I got 2 comments, but can I ask her a question?
Sure.
So I got a little confused on the bed tax and the alcohol and tobacco tax. So if we had an alcohol and tobacco tax, say 2%, would we only be able to raise our bed and car rental tax to 2%, or could we cap that at 12?
Usually they want to see uniformity, but it's a good question, not a clean answer. So we would have to look at what we're raising and how. Generally, though, the excise taxes often go in step with at least one other tax.
So if we did alcohol and tobacco at 2, that would count as, or would we?
So you would have this excise tax on an itemized list of things at a uniform rate would be the most. And I say this as general tax advice, not on a particular, but I think that's what you would be looking at, a uniform tax rate on excise items.
So our bed tax is currently 6, so if we did a 2% alcohol tax, we could raise that to 8 and be okay?
You would likely maintain your bed tax at 6, and then you would have the 2. So you have a lower tax, might not have the same, it doesn't raise the same concerns as, the adopting or increasing one tax and not.
On the borough, I'm definitely opposed to the borough, and I was opposed to Girdwood, which I think most community members were, just because they were going to become a city, they were going to have to build a school. We were all going to get to share in that, I guess. And if Valdez doesn't get in the borough with us, it's really pointless for 3 broke communities be in a borough and be broke together. Valdez is the richest town in the Prince William Sound, and I think that's why most people are against it. I'm kind of with James. If Valdez was on board and they still had money, I don't know what Dunleavy's gonna do to them, but I think that's what most community members feel like. So, and city council, if they back the community up with some sort of resolution I think people would be pretty happy to hear that. I think they'd be pretty happy that their council was looking at their best interests. So, that's all I got. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Gardner.
I got another quick question for you on that. It's my understanding, and I have been very confused a lot of times before in my life, so this is a big one. But anything, if Valdez did go into a borough with us, anything that they're currently taxing before we go into that borough together, like the pipeline and the terminal and that stuff, those dollars that are taxed on that after we become a borough stay with Valdez. They get collected by the borough, but then they get passed back through to Valdez. So we wouldn't really be accessing any of those dollars that they're currently already taxing, right?
I don't know. I just don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I know where to find it, but I don't know the answer. Because I think, you know, I'm not sure, because you will be creating a charter, you will be creating taxing mechanisms, so I'm not sure if there's direction. Maybe.
Well, I think what makes this complicated is we have to.
Say, Matt, could I just have you share your name
Certainly.
and residence for the record? Thank you.
Hello, this is, my name is Matt McDaniel. I'm representing a couple communities within Prince William Sound. And I'm here to discuss support for an opposition resolution. I've been here, coming through here for a couple months, and I just want to say thanks to all the council members that have taken their time to be in open dialogue with me to talk about concerns. But just to speak to what I hear is that, you know, you have a feasibility study, you've got an economic study, but there's also a lot of complexities in just creating a government and how taxes are shared, who pays taxes, and where things are going to be, which I think really throws the feasibility of a proposed borough into a tailspin. But I have some specific things I wanted to share with you guys. I know you have limited time.
Yes, please.
Just on the economics, I think I spoke to the economics. You guys have spoken to those. You discussed the governor's budget, not very much room for additional revenue from oil tax. I wanted to speak to two things, and that is just risks that I don't think are assessed on not opposing a borough. And I also want to highlight just some messaging around the GGA. Recently, and it's in your attachment, the GGA sends out a letter and has put something in the paper saying they're not, thanks for participating in the feasibility study. We're encouraged, however, we're gonna stop, we're not gonna fund a phase 2 feasibility study, and we're gonna work with Girdwood on a feasibility study. And anyone reading this might assume that they've kind of bowed out, but I just wanted to share with this committee that could be the furthest thing from the truth. If nothing more than to keep this committee from being exhausted with them coming back over and over again. Please reference their website, and I won't read all of it, but they go through a process in their work plan, which is very current, which is detaching from Girdwood, from the municipality of Anchorage, incorporating Girdwood as a city, and joining the Prince William Sound Borough, Turnagain Borough, with other cities, Whittier, Cordova, Valdez, and unincorporated communities. And I also just wanted to communicate who these people are. It's not discussed very much. This is a small group of, from what I understand, people that develop real estate. They don't represent Girdwood, and they have 5 bullets on their website. One of them is, why would Girdwood want to leave Anchorage? One of them that was telling was the Heritage Land Bank is the owner and record of much of Girdwood's real property, especially vacant land, by delaying efforts to make even modest amounts of appropriate land available for private housing through MOA HLB is impeding progress in addressing Girdwood's precedent for affordable housing. So I just wanted, I'm not going to make an opinion of that. I just wanted to share what's on the website, and I want people to understand. I just want people to know they'll be back, and they're openly talking about it in a current updated document. And then to conclude, you know, I've been racking my brain to say, you know, the question's asked, why is this such an emergency? well, why are all these communities getting together and what are they concerned about? Why is it just, this is the last community in the Prince William Sound? And something I didn't even realize when I walked into this project is the Boundary Commission doesn't need Cordova's permission to create a borough. They can take a proxy vote of all the community members that are gonna be affected by the borough. And we're trying to get ahead of that. And so just assessing the risks, you know, if it was brought up, you know, these motions don't have a lot of teeth because new committees can come up and change it. But at the end of the day, if this is put into a vote, you guys have control of the process, and we're trying to get ahead of that, if that makes sense. So it'd be a very strong statement if we were able to say that the Prince William Sound, every community in the Prince William Sound is in opposition of a borough. Because behind the scenes, we use that, we are working with our state and federal legislation, and we're working with the Boundary Commission on all their reporting to ensure that that doesn't take place. So it's more of giving you back control. If it's sometime down, you know, being in opposition, and I wanted to ask that question too. If they came forward and were in opposition, and down the road conditions changed, is that a major concern from them doing it in the future?
From a legal perspective, it is far less concerning for you to oppose and then support than it is for you to support and then try to oppose, for reasons that I think you probably can guess. I mean, a lot of the criteria deals with the harmony and feasibility on a grander scale of the unity of these groups and their ability to create another layer of governance. So if you have said that that unity is there, that there are these symmetries, then it's hard to take that back. So that is, as your attorney, my biggest concern is that you don't say something in conversation that something that binds you or is thrown back at you during a petition process later. Because one of the things, so while you would have a vote in the formation of a borough, you are not as large as some of the other communities that would participate in that vote, namely Girdwood. You know, and so they would be going for, my understanding, they would be a home rule borough step. They would be incorporating both as a home rule city as well as part of a home rule borough, which means you have a lot more votes. And I'm not sure what the population is of Girdwood right now, but it's
2,100.
I think they're 27, and then I think Valdez is 4,000. So either way, we're not the biggest.
Any way it goes, we're down the line.
You're not the loudest voice in the room on that vote. So that's
Which
yeah.
I just want to highlight.
Good point. You may be the loudest.
That could be a potential risk of losing control of the process if it actually makes it to a proxy vote, and that is fair. That's a risk. Is it fair to say that's a risk? I think so.
Which is why I think, you know, personally, I think it's important that we go on the record as opposing it, because then all of the communities in Prince William Sound are on board with opposing it. And if you have a community that's outside the Prince William Sound region that's trying to push for formation of a borough, the Boundary Commission will look into that and see that there isn't the harmony, and it could help us in that fashion in the future.
Okay,
I'll conclude.
okay, yes, please.
I just, obviously, I thought the stronger language would be more appropriate, and I'd really appreciate and endorse the second resolution. And then I just want to conclude by saying the other way that the Boundary Commission can get a borough approved is if they feel that if the legislature feels it's in the best interest of the state. The Boundary Commission can just go to the legislature. So thank you for your time. Thank you for considering my comments.
Okay, thank you. I think that's been helpful. Council, we're at the end of our work session, and of course, these items will be debated during the regular meeting, so With no objection, we'll adjourn.